Well, we good? Yep. All right. Well, good evening, church. It's good to be here. Nice weather. I'm very thankful for that. I was actually in my room getting ready, and I usually don't turn on the AC. I just have the window open because it stays nice, but it was really hot, so I had to turn it on today. So I'm thankful for that. Welcome tonight to our Bible study. If you can see, I kind of tried to follow Mark's outline here, so hopefully it'll make it easy to follow for you. But tonight we're in Genesis chapter 40. So where Mark left off is where we're picking up. I named this the starting from the bottom again. There's some parallelism here with how Joseph was in the well or the cistern, and then he kind of got brought to Egypt, and so now we're seeing that again. He's kind of in the pits again, literally, but also figuratively here. And obviously a lot of us are going to know the end of his story. So kind of at the top of our notes here, chapters 40 and 41 are kind of one big narrative. Obviously we're only focusing on 40 tonight, but they tell that whole comeback story of Joseph going from the prison and then to the eventual kind of second in command of Egypt, where he ends up being. And this shouldn't come as a surprise. If we've been studying through this, you remember Joseph's dreams that he had whenever he was younger, the bowing down dreams. And so that's kind of what we're going to see play out in the next few chapters. And so, to the attentive reader, that should be seen ahead of time. But we also see that his coming to power, or the ways that he does, is kind of less expected because he begins this road back to power through humble service, which we can kind of expect again from Joseph at this point, but that again is a key point here. So as we start off, this chapter I kind of broke into a lot of smaller sections. It's what a lot of the commentaries did, and then I couldn't figure out a better way to do it, so I just let them do that. So the first section we've got tonight, I called New Company. I did come up with these titles, so we'll see. But New Company is what I called it. We're going to see the new prisoners that are going to come in with Joseph here. So let's read verses 1 through 4. It says, "Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody." And so as we read through here, we're going to see a few things. That first phrase, "sometime after this," is actually it's obviously a phrase that's going to connect 39 and 40, but it also basically only does that. We don't know how much time passed between Joseph being put in prison to now. It could have been, a month. It could have been 10 months. It could have been 10 years. We don't know. There's not too much clarity there. And so all we know is that it is a continuation from 39 to 40. And so we also know that the prison that Joseph was in, it would have actually been connected or in Potiphar's house to some level, maybe a dungeon or something connected to Potiphar's house, because Potiphar was he was the captain of the guard. That would have been just part of that role. But this also kind of shows that detail. Last week we talked about how we don't really know if Potiphar believed his wife. He may not have, because that's just possibly what she was doing. She kept accusing people. But the fact that, Joseph is still staying kind of in Potiphar's house shows that it's possible that Potiphar knew his wife was lying. But we also see the two men that come in here. So we see the cupbearer and the baker. To us, we think maybe that these are just servants of Pharaoh, but they're actually a little bit more than that. They're not just a lowly, menial position. Their positions were actually kind of higher. They would have been very close to Pharaoh, very trusted. You think about, a chef and basically a wine taster sort of thing. kind of the last defense, I guess, or first, or however order you want to put it, against poisoning and stuff like that. The baker was in charge of making the food, therefore making it right and not killing Pharaoh. And the cupbearer would have been, bringing in the drinks. These guys were very close to Pharaoh, is kind of what I'm trying to get across here. So because of that, we don't really know what that offense is that they committed. It just says that they committed an offense. In Hebrew, forgive me, I took Greek, so I don't know exactly how to pronounce Hebrew. I looked it up. But the word for the committed an offense is kata. It's H-A-T-A, so kata, something like that. But this is the word that's actually used down in verse 9, which we aren't there yet. It's verse 9 of chapter 39. So if you look back last week, we were in 39. Verse 9 there, that's the same word that's used. And this indicates that whatever they did wasn't small or trivial. It's a word used for sin. It's a kind of a bigger word than just like, oh, they made an oopsie. They made the wrong food for him. They did something. We don't know what. Like I said, it could be poisoning since they were in charge of not doing that. So they could have been caught trying to do something like that. And so, yeah, again, that's kind of all we know there. The two men were likely being put under guard at this point until Pharaoh could decide what he was going to do with them. And we'll see this as the chapter plays out. This was more of a temporary holding for these two men. It wasn't their final thing. Prison wasn't ever the final thing in this time period, so we know that. But we'll see as well. It says they continued for some time. Again, this is no indication. It's at the end there in verse 4. It says they continued for some time in custody. There's no indication of how much time has passed again. The author is pretty vague here, but I think that's on purpose because that's not what this story is about. We will see really the meaning of this chapter, I think, comes towards the end. And again, most of us know how this plays out, but I really think that some of those last lines are what the author's really trying to get across. So we don't need to get caught up in the time frame. It's not while this is a historical document, it's not a historical document in the way that we see it. So moving on to verse 5, it says, "And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, 'Why are your faces downcast today?' They said to him, 'We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them.' And Joseph said to them, 'Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me.'" And so, like verse 1 sets up that first section, verse 5 is going to set up this next section. Verse 5, it says, the one night they both dreamed dreams. This is setting up what we're about to read. Again, it's a very kind of vague thing. And the author, again, does this on purpose. He's just trying to say they had, in the phrase, each dream with its own interpretation is basically just saying that the dreams have different meanings. A lot of this, what's being written here, is kind of taken at face value, and there's not much more that we can take from it. So I don't know if Mark did that to me on purpose or if I didn't study hard enough. So, but from the commentaries I read, they all agreed that they don't know aside from what it's telling them. So verse 5, it's just what it says. And then we kind of move down there to verse 8. It says, Joseph is saying here that the meaning of these significant dreams belongs to God. So when he says that do not interpretations belong to God, really he's just saying that the meaning of dreams and the significance of dreams itself is what is sent from God, and God is the one who does that. Revelations coming through dreams were common in Egypt. This was a common thing in their culture. It wasn't unknown to them. And actually they had what they called like a book of dreams or a dream book or something. It would have been kind of like a commentary for dreams. And so they would have had specific dream interpreters that you can go to. I think you would pay them usually. And they would tell you what your dream meant. And this was common in Egypt at the time. And so I think this is happening for a reason now, that Joseph is here in this situation. And actually, they kind of really only went to Joseph to get their dream interpreted because he's the only option. It's those three in prison, and they are distraught because they can't go to anyone else to interpret their dreams. They can't leave to get them interpreted. So this opens an opportunity for Joseph. It's sort of like nowadays we see these open opportunities for the gospel. It's not coincidences, believe it or not. And so that's similar to what we're seeing here. Additionally, we see that Joseph was confident in his ability, actually not his ability, but in the ability God would give him to interpret these dreams. We see that obviously Joseph had those dreams back in the earlier chapters. He had those dreams, but other than that, we have no evidence that Joseph knew how to interpret dreams or that this was a skill of his. There's just zero evidence pointing towards that, and so this is a way that Joseph is trusting in God to bring him just the meaning of these dreams. Also here, I'd like to point out a British scholar and translator, John Goldingay. He sees some parallels between Joseph and Daniel here. He was the only one out of my study. He was the only one who brought this to light in the depth that he did. So I'm not sure that it was intentional, but I think that it is there, and I'm going to point it out to us. But kind of what he brings up is that so far in Genesis, up until now, all of the dreams that people have had have not needed outside interpretation, which is kind of interesting to think about. A lot of those dreams, like the one that Joseph had earlier, it's kind of it's almost self-evident, or at least it didn't need an interpretation at the time. But in chapters 40 through 42 of Genesis, there's dreams that need interpretation. Through these prisoners, Pharaoh will have a dream that needs interpreted, and that's just kind of a unique thing. But that's also is what's happening in Daniel as well. There's dreams in Daniel that need interpretation, and so that's Goldingay's kind of first point that he brings, first parallel between the two. There's not much evidence, like I said, that Joseph knew how to do this. And so it was very bold of him to invite the dreamers for this interpretation. And Goldingay says that this boldness from Joseph compares to Daniel's boldness in the first and second chapters of Daniel as well. This is referring in those chapters specifically to when Daniel asks to be put on that diet and have him tested to see if he's stronger or whatever. That's that boldness that Goldingay is referring to. As well as, there's kind of two more, the location that Joseph is in and the location that Daniel is in are very significant to the story itself. So with Daniel, he's in Babylon, and that's kind of important for that entire narrative. And same with Joseph's narrative, Egypt being the power that it is, and it's going to have the ability to sustain and be powerful through that famine. There's just significance between both the locations. And then finally, they both reject the scientific, like I said, the scientific way of interpreting dreams. There was that commentary-esque book of dreams that would have been science at the time, which is fair enough. That's the only thing they have. But they both rejected that, and they actually turned to God. Both Daniel and Joseph did. So that's Goldingay's argument for kind of the parallelism, and I didn't include that in your guys' notes, but like I said, he was the only one who brought it up. But it is interesting to look at, and I would agree that it is not a coincidence or it's not a coincidence, or not just a coincidence. I think there's some parallelism there. But like he mentions, Daniel's written hundreds, or maybe not hundreds, but quite some time after this is written, and so it could be some taking on inspiration from it as well. So as we move on to the next section, verses 9 through 15, titled this A Favorable Dream. So we're going to see the first dream interpreted here. And so starting off in verse 9. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly, when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into this pit." And so we see kind of the interpretation play out here, and we've all seen this story before. But I kind of want to point out at the end here, Joseph is asking for a favor from the cupbearer for this dream interpretation. But like I said earlier, they would have went somewhere to pay to get their dream interpreted. So this is kind of Joseph's ask for, he did this for him, and so he's just asking for a favor in return. It wouldn't have come as a surprise to that cupbearer. And like I said, it actually, the priests, diviners, and other interpreters would have been paid for this sort of thing outside of the prison walls. And again, the cupbearer, like I said earlier, he would have had a significant role. So he was someone who would have been close to Pharaoh, and so he would have been able to speak on Joseph's behalf and actually have some leeway there, or have some sway. It wasn't a menial role. If this cupbearer didn't mean anything, then he would have done Joseph no good to talk good about him. So another point there. In verse 14, I think it's a misspelling on yours, but when it says kindness there in verse 14, the word that it is in Hebrew is actually hesed, and that should kind of ring a bell for you, even if I'm mispronouncing it. But this is the word for covenantal love. This is kind of that word that we see throughout the Old Testament for that sort of covenantal love. And that's what Joseph is asking for from this prisoner. He's asking for this kind of mindfulness and this sort of dedication and remembrance. He's asking for this not from God, but from a fellow prisoner here, which is interesting because this word is typically used between God and people and that sort of thing. But kind of what that means, though, is Joseph is just asking for commitment. He's asking for this cupbearer to commit to speak well on his behalf. And we'll see what actually happens. And then the last thing to point out, and again, this isn't in your notes either, but Joseph, at the end of verse 15, he says, "Also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." And so again, we're kind of seeing a parallel from that original pit that he was thrown into this pit now. Again, this would have been in Potiphar's house, so some commentaries weren't quite sure whether this was a dungeon or something in Potiphar's house or if it was just a separate thing, but it's some sort of pit. It would have been some sort of holding place, and they usually dug pits for that sort of deal. And so just another little parallel there. So moving on now to verse 16, and we're going to go through 19. And so we saw a favorable dream in the last section, and what this now I'm naming this next one is a nightmare, because it really is a nightmare, both the dream and how it's going to play out. So the dream itself: when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, "I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head." And Joseph answered and said, "This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree. The birds will eat the flesh from you." And so even though these dreams are kind of similar, Joseph is, these dreams are pretty similar, but Joseph is showing his skill, or at least the ability that God gave him, in discerning the big differences in the interpretations. These are 2 very different meanings. We see the language, the phrase lifting up the head, or lifting your head up, that sort of deal. Typically this was a positive thing. It would have meant to bring honor, but here it is a very negative action. He's lifting him up to kill him, sort of deal. I think someone mentioned to me about how some of these Bible or some of these chapters in previous were getting, talk about Potiphar's wife and some other stuff with women, and someone said they were a little X-rated Tonight, it's going to be the same way. It's going to be a little gruesome with this interpretation here. As we kind of go on, that punishment that this baker is going to receive is not a light one. So again, he was going to not only be punished, but he was going to be executed. And not only was he going to be executed, but he was going to be executed via beheading and then impaling and then worse, actually. The additional comment about the birds, so he was going to be eaten by the birds, and so that is an extra punishment after this person's death. And this would have been because of Egypt's culture and at the time and what they believed about the dead and undead. And so this punishment meant to continue after death. And so this would have meant two things that were punishment. Number one, there was not going to be much left of him, and he was not going to be able to share in the family's tomb that they would have had. This would have been very dishonorable, to not be able to be buried with your family, especially in these days. So this also would not have left much of him because Egyptians believed that about 3,000 years after you died, you came back to your body. So that was why they embalmed the mummies so well, the pharaohs and stuff. They preserved those bodies very well because when you come back after being dead for 3,000 years, you don't want to come back to just skeletons because you're not going to come back. So that's why they did that. But that's also why when they punished him like this, there wouldn't have been anything left. And so really that punishment now continues on after death. And that would have been a very horrible death for the Egyptians and really any of us today. The interpretation of the second dream is horrifying, but interesting enough, the narrator doesn't say what the baker's reaction to this is. I was reading one of the gospel accounts for a class, and it was the Pharisees were responding to one of Jesus' stories. It was about the tenants in the vineyard. He was renting out the vineyard to the tenants, and Jesus' point was because the tenants kept beating up the man's servants, and so that Jesus said that the owner would go and surely kill these tenants who were being disobedient. And it tells of the Pharaoh's response, the Pharisees' response. I can't remember what it was, but they were very taken back that Jesus would say such a thing. I think they said, God forbid it, actually. And so it's interesting that this baker just got kind of doomed, and his reaction is not in here. I'm sure it wasn't a good reaction, though, and I'm sure he wasn't going to pay Joseph for that service.
Where did you get the information about the Egyptians believing that the body returns every 3,000 years?
Yeah, I got that from one of my commentaries. I didn't write it down which one it was. They're actually all in the back of my car, so I can. There's one that's not in the back of my car, so if it's in one of the four other ones, I'll pull it out real quick. But yeah. Yeah, I hadn't either, and I think it was only one commentary that mentioned that. I looked through a handful of commentaries. They're all huge because they're Genesis ones, but yeah, I hadn't heard that either. But I mean, it would make sense. That's because they mentioned that as well as that's why they embalmed, and so I mean, that makes sense to me. So, and I have not written a commentary, so I took their word for it. But yeah, so. Moving on now to the last section, verses 20 through 23. It starts off, on the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And so these are the verses that I kind of, like I was saying, is the point of the story, at least that I think to be true. But we see in verse 20, it says Pharaoh's birthday. Something interesting is that it probably wasn't his birthday. It could have just been his day of his ascension into his role or his coronation as king. Just a small detail. Although it is funny that the narrator, or the writer, author, Moses, decided to tell us that it was Pharaoh's birthday, but wasn't going to tell us how long Joseph had been in prison for this time. We got on reading about all those vagueness, but here the author thinks it's important to tell us it was Pharaoh's birthday. So happy birthday to Pharaoh. But and again, we see the narrator who moves briskly along to telling the outcome of the prisoners. So, immediately from the interpretation, that switch, we see 3 days later, none of those 3 days is told. I'm sure I would hate to have been the prisoner who was going to die during those 3 days, because it wasn't like the dream was interpreted and it was happening tomorrow. He had to wait 3 days before he had to meet his doom, or I'm sure he was hoping it wasn't. But we also see in the end, we see that where there should have been remembering, there was forgetting. And so I think this is the focus of the story, that last verse there. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember, but forgot him. And so I think this is what the narrator is trying to tell us. This is what he's trying to point to here. It says forgetting injustices like the cupbearer did is a sin, and it's one that harms others. This is something that we can take today. There's injustices that happen all over the earth, all over the world, and we pray for them and we keep them in mind and stuff. But even though we can't do anything about them here and now, about these injustices, that's not what we're called to do all the time, we can still remember them, and we do that in many ways. Remember them through the prayers, like the missions team and stuff, through prayers or through donating to them, that sort of deal. But it's when these injustices are forgotten, when nobody is paying attention to them, when they're not getting the attention, then nobody's even going to go and help, that sort of deal. And so I think that is kind of what's going on here. But in chapter 39, Joseph was the victim of Potiphar's wife, and in chapter 40, he's the victim of the cupbearer. In both of these situations, God uses them as a stepping stone, though. Both of these situations we see as kind of Joseph's, not downfall, but definitely not something great to happen to you. But God is going to use them as stepping stones that eventually lead him back to rule. And so just some application that I've got for us tonight. It's some pretty kind of basic and overall or general ones. I like to be more specific with applications. I like to tell you what to do this week, but I don't think there is that clear thing here tonight. I think it is a little bit more broad and just something to keep in mind, and almost just a mindset to focus on. But the first thing I've gotten written down is trust in God's timing and plan. Again, we don't know how long Joseph was in this prison, at least up until this point. We will see. We're going to look forward ahead, and we're going to cheat, but don't tell Mark. But the first sentence of chapter 41 says Joseph was in there for 2 full years until the next chapter. So who knows how long Joseph was in there? I can tell you at least he was in there for 2 years and 4 days, but we don't know outside of that. So trusting God's timing and plan. I don't know where you guys are at this evening, besides physically, but I mean, he's got a plan for all of us. That's good news. I was in Bible study on Sunday. I'm not calling you out, don't worry. I'm not calling you out. But I was in Bible study with the youth group on Sunday, and we were talking about the death and resurrection of Christ, and it's something that's kind of hard to think about, the fact that we put Jesus to death, but it is the good news, and this is the same thing. Even when we go through the hard times in life, we can still look to the good news, and that's that we are, number one, forgiven by Jesus, but number two, on God's timing, not our own. And that's difficult for me. I'm a planner. I have already considered what I'm doing out of college, and that's not for another year, over a year. And so what that means is I get my hopes killed pretty often. I get my hopes up, and then they come right back down. So, but that's my first application. Moving on, like I mentioned at the beginning, Joseph's humble service is kind of what brought him to this, through this chapter. And so that's kind of my second point, is serve those whom God has put in front of you. So I don't know who's put in front of you every day. I don't know if it's just the cashier at Walmart or whatever it is, but look for ways to serve people. As we mentioned, Joseph had 0 prior training, practice, knowledge on how to interpret dreams, but he boldly invited the dreams and said, all right, give them to me. I trust God's going to give me what I need to interpret them. And so I am going to challenge you guys to do the same. If there's any way that you can even think of possibly serving whoever's in front of you, just ask God for what you need to do to serve them, and trust in Him and His timing and His plan. And then the last thing I've got written down there is be patient and faithful in your relationship with God. Joseph is still following the Lord after all of this. He's still following God because, he was sold to Egypt, and he kind of rose. He, was making his way up in Potiphar's house, but then this happened, and he's back down again. And it could be that he saw that he's already gone from the bottom to the top, and he's going to trust it's happening again. But it could have very well been easy for him to throw in the towel at that point and just give up, because again, after 2 years of sitting in prison, and at least nothing significant happened for it to be written down. So it's after 2 years, he was still trusting and still leaning and believing and following God through that. And so just be patient and faithful in your relationship. And that comes with the whole trusting in God's timing. And then before I came here, I've got this book that I kept forgetting to read in preparation, or look at in preparation for this, but I looked at before coming here. It's the Big Idea Companion for Preaching and Teaching. It's a big it's not that big, but it's a homiletics book. I'm sure Mark loves it, if I had to guess. Carla, yeah. He probably highly recommends it. But basically, it's Mark, like how he's got the big idea every week. It's a book that does that for a lot of, like all of Scripture. But like for this, for chapter 40 and 41, the big idea that it put down, or it writes, it says, God gifts us to play our part in his big story. And that's the big idea I've got for us tonight, and also actually it's for next week too. It's for chapters 40 and 41. But again, God gifts us to play our part in his big story. It's not our story. And really, we don't even have a big part in it. We've got a small part in his big story, and God's going to give us what we need to get through that. And it also wrote, it expanded on that a little bit. It said, God prospered Joseph in Egypt by giving him the ability to interpret dreams. And so because of that, he was able to touch the men here, or in this passage. He was able to interpret dreams, which led him to Pharaoh favoring him. We're going to see that next chapter, which then led him to be second in command, which is going to be in further passages. But he's not only second in command, but he's second in command during that famine, and we all know what kind of happens there. And so it's this ability that God gives him to play in that big picture role. And I think that's all I've got for you tonight. I knew it was going to be a shorter night. I think we all joke whenever Mark's around. It's we start a little bit later and we end a little bit earlier. So I guess you're welcome, unless anyone has any questions or anything to add. I mean, you guys probably know more than I do. So if there's anything, or if you have any questions, I don't know that I said everything there is to say.
Don't be too disappointed on the people who you trust.
Yeah. Don't be too disappointed on the people you trust, is what he said. So that's true, because even though the cupbearer did forget him, we don't know why. We don't know why the cupbearer forgot him. It could have been, timing. Yeah, like she said as well, timing wasn't right, and so it's stuff like that where we can get upset that it's not going our way. I understand that thoroughly, but it is God's timing still. It was probably God who made that cupbearer forget, if we're going to be honest. And so, it's how that plays out.
Interesting word selection by Moses, and I guess actually Joseph, when he said, your head's going to be lifted up. Mm-hmm. Your head's going to be lifted off.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
And there, I haven't interpreted too many dreams, although I thought about some of the ones I've had. Mm-hmm. I feel like I'm standing on shaky ground interpreting other people's dreams.
Yep.
But as we listen to people and they're asking for counsel, I'd like to know what you think. I think it's really important to choose the words that we use, and not only choose our words well, but then ask the question. So, do you understand what I just said? And would you put that in your words?
Yeah.
I can't. It's hard to imagine the reaction of these two men, especially the second guy. When he heard such a, "Hey, good news."
Yeah.
I wish I would have never asked you, Dan, or Joseph.
Yeah, exactly. And like it said, when the chief baker saw the interpretation was favorable. So he wasn't just asking, he was thinking he was going to get a good one. But Yeah, and the restating as well. Joseph very well could have told him that interpretation 3 different ways before the baker believed him too. So yeah. Was there a hand over here? Maybe not. But yeah, it's a good story. It's a fun story. Yeah, I think that's all I've got.